Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vinashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalaraso Priti Prasannananan Shajwad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Murakelatu Bande Bhagavatani Manundavam Murdnani Patyakshitu Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Trishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Sivak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jahavete Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachito Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Ganai Shila Tahate Na Hoydo Murachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Seha Kyad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janivera Serariti Shuni le vorohohit Shriyatam nityam Gyatam mura Chintyatam bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, Sri Raghunath, and Sri Jiva, Sri Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami. Again today we will observe ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. We resume again in the Sanatan Shiksha, Madhya Lila, chapter 22, discussion of Abhideya, how Krishna Bhakti is the principal Abhideya of the Shastra. So we've come through a series of reasons presented for this conclusion, and we're now hearing an elaboration of one, which is that anyone who takes the Krishna Bhakti with whatever motivation they may have will ultimately achieve the highest object that they ever could, even if they never initially wanted or conceived of pursuing it. So in other words, this path is so excellent that if someone somehow or another stumbles onto it, no matter where they're trying to go, the path itself will somehow carry them in the right direction, even though they were initially headed to another destination. This is the idea, so to speak. So today we'll hear the reasoning for that. How is it that persons seeking one object end up giving up their desire for that object after having taken up bhakti as a means to achieve that other object? Usually, when we take up a means to achieve an object, but we find that it is leading us towards an object other than the one that we seek, then we leave the process and find a new process to get us to get to the goal we're trying to get to. So why is it that the people, upon coming to this process, find the process so valuable that they give up the previous goal and just stick with the process and go wherever the process itself takes them? This is the concept that's being explained. So we'll start from verse 37, and we can just bear in mind that this is elaborating on the last verse of the Bhagavatam that was cited in the discussion last time. Akama sarva kamo va moksha kamo daradi tibrena bhakti yogena bhajata Yajeta Purusham Param, that one should worship the Supreme Purush with Bhakti Yoga. And whether one wants moksha, whether one wants all varieties of worldly or otherworldly enjoyment, or one is desireless, meaning a one-pointed bhakta with no self-interest, whatever the case may be, one should worship the Supreme Purush with bhakti. So, what does Bhagavan do once someone starts doing that? That's what we'll hear now. So, Anya kami jadi kore Krishnara bhajan, na magiteu Krishna thare dena swacharan. If a desirer of other objects performs worship of Sri Krishna, Krishna gives him his own feet, even though he did not ask for them. So if you start worshipping Krishna's feet, watch out. You're going to end up stuck with those feet, or stuck to those feet. So why does Krishna decide to do this? So Krishna's rationale for granting his own feet even to worshippers who don't ask for them, since they seek other objects, is stated in the following payar. So the tippani explains this as follows. He shows the cause in this regard, meaning he speaks the next payar. And what is that cause? It is simply Krishna's grace. In other words, when Krishna sees that someone is worshipping him, then that worship of him, that bhakti towards him, evokes his grace upon the worshipper. And in being gracious, he considers the well-being of that worshipper from his perspective, not just the perspective of the worshipper. So what does he think? And how does he apply that? We'll hear that in the coming statements. Krishna kohe amaya bhaje, mage vishaya sukh, amrita chari vish mage, e bhoro murk. Krishna says to himself, when worshipped by those seeking objects other than himself, quote, he worships me, but asks for the pleasure of sense objects. He rejects nectar and asks for poison. He is a great fool. So elsewhere in the Caritamrta, we also hear this statement of Mahaprabhu, where he speaks similarly, saying that Vishoy kore maha andha, that the influence of Vishoy, or the objects and the conditioning of the mind that comes from sensory experience, makes one completely andha, blind. Or here, someone is described as a great fool. So blindness or foolishness, when one's psyche is completely conditioned to sensory experience, this is considered a state of blindness and foolishness. In other words, a state in which one is unable to understand one's own best interest and act accordingly. So when someone's psyche is so conditioned, then even when they worship Krishna, they do so only to perpetuate their own entanglement in samsara, to perpetuate their own subjectivity to suffering and illusion. So seeing this, Krishna is compassionate, Krishna is gracious to them, and he thinks, why should I give them what they want? Even though they might be happy with it in the temporary scale of things, they won't truly ever be happy by giving them what they want. So why should I give it to them even though they want it? Therefore, he decides, Ami vigyai murke vishay kene dibo, swacharanamrita diya vishaya bulaibo. I, however, am wise. Means he's a fool, but I'm not. So why should I act like a fool just because someone else is foolish? Why should I give this fool objects of the senses? I will give him the nectar of my own feet and cause him to forget the objects of the senses. I'll give him something far better than even what he wants. And once he gets that, eventually he'll understand the superiority of what he got and the fact that I was being good by not giving him what he wanted. So this dynamic is that's been described in these last three payars is evidenced in the following verse of the Bhagavad, which also came in the Bhakti Sandarbha. Satyam dishyatartitam artito nrinam naivartado yat punaratita yataha swayam vidatte bhajatam anichatam icha pidanam nijapada palavam. Quote, "It is true that he," meaning Bhagavan, "grants the desired objects of human beings when requested by them to do so. He is not, however, a bestower of objects from which further requests arise. Thus, he of his own accord offers undesirous worshippers the blossoms of his feet, which cover over all other desires." So, Bhagavan is a wish-fulfilling tree, so to speak, or he does give people whatever they want. But he doesn't give it to them if the thing that they want is something that's just going to keep them perpetually coming back and asking for more. So when people want something that won't actually be satisfying to them, then he gives them something better. So he gives people what's actually in their own best interest, not just what they want. If what they want is in their best interest, then he gives them that. And when it's not, then he gives them what's actually in their best interest rather than what it is they specifically want. Similarly, in the 11th canto, we hear in the exchange between Uddhava and Krishna in a series of very short questions and answers. Then when Uddhava has a question, what is truth? Then Krishna's answer is speech that is in the best interest of the listener. That's the purport of what he says. And the way it's explained in the commentary is that truth is not simply facts or literally what happened, but to speak to someone with their well-being in mind and so as to best benefit them. This is to be truthful, as opposed to saying something which might be factually evident, but which might actually not be in the best interest of the person to hear, or might hurt the person's feelings, or what have you. So just as, quote, truthfulness, or being truthful, is actually fundamentally more about being good, speaking with goodwill and in the best interest of the listener, so too here being compassionate or being gracious to someone isn't just giving people what they want, but it's ensuring that they get what they actually need, or what's actually really good for them. So the rub comes, so to speak, or the question comes when the recipient of that truth or of that graciousness isn't able to recognize the fact that this is actually what's best for them. So here in the commentary, we'll see an analogy which deals with that subject. So let's hear now Jiva Gosvami's commentary on this topic, which illuminates what was said in the previous payars and also reiterates why Krishna Bhakti is the principle of Videya. So it's precisely on this line of thought that this verse is cited. Or in other words, as Kaviraja Goswami is laying out all these statements in favor of Krishna Bhakti as the Abhideya, surprise, surprise, each of the verses he quotes is all in the Bhakti Sandarbha and is all related to points that Jiva Goswami makes in the process of establishing Krishna Bhakti as the Abhideya. So, Jiva Goswami's discussion is rendered as follows. Those, however, who are not greatly wise. So here he starts out with precisely, the way it was characterized here in the Caitanya-caritamrta by saying, they're fools. He's saying, those who are not quite wise, as like Bhagavan, perhaps a little softer way of saying it. Those, however, who are not greatly wise, perform worship of Sri Vishnu only as a limb of karma or otherwise, such as Gyan, for the attainment of those objects. That is, for the purpose of attaining the goals of those paths. Consequently, because of this offense to it, that is bhakti, it's being a bestower upon such persons only of the result of their own desire, and it's being indefinite in that respect as well. That is, it not necessarily doing even that in all cases occurs. So the purpose of bhakti is to please Bhagavan. If you use bhakti as a means to get what you want and make the pleasing bhakti's nature of being pleasing to Bhagavan a secondary element of an enactment of bhakti, then that's a disrespect of bhakti. That's an offense to bhakti, because what its essential character is not being kept in the primary function, the primary aspect of its enactment, or the purpose for which it's being used. Just as, to use a brand new fancy, mobile phone as a paperweight, it can also do that, but that's not really what it's for. That's the least of the capacities that it has. So if you were to spend all the money it takes on a phone and then use it as a paperweight, that's, so to speak, a disrespect to the iPhone or to the engineers who made it, so to speak. So similarly, when bhakti has this incredible capacity that nothing else does, the one and only thing that can do something as amazing as satisfying the Lord of the universe, satisfying the Lord of innumerable universes, and then you use that just to, acquire some sense enjoyment that you could acquire by so many other means, that's not to show respect to bhakti, or that's not to utilize bhakti in a dignified way, considering what a great thing bhakti is. If you call upon some highly prestigious, leader of a postgraduate research think tank and say, "Can you come and teach my kindergartner some English?" It's like, hey, this is not, a proper utilization of this person's skill set. So similarly, to use bhakti for such a low purpose is actually disrespectful to bhakti. So when someone does so, then here Jiva Gosvami is describing that as actually an aparad, or a disrespect, an offense to bhakti. And when bhakti is being offended, then whether it will produce the effect that it has the power to give or not is not necessarily guaranteed. When performed independently, however, means if someone uses bhakti but doesn't make it subordinate to karma or gyan and use it for a secondary purpose, but uses it for a secondary purpose independently of these other paths, then even if only for the attainment of those objects, certainly bhakti's being a stower of those results occurs. So bhakti can definitely bring about the attainment of whatever someone wants, and it will do so, even if it's utilized in that secondary sense, but when it's not utilized in a secondary sense and a subordinate sense to karma and gyan. But when it's both made secondary and subordinate, then there isn't necessarily a guarantee of its effectiveness, which is not a slight or an indication of the lack of bhakti's capacity, but rather that uncertainty arises because of the mentality of the person. Okay, moving on. And it is not that the end of bhakti's influence occurs with the bestowal only of those results. So when someone uses bhakti to get even some secondary or lower objective, that's not all bhakti provides for them. Rather, in the end, bhakti's verily being a bestower of the supreme result occurs as well. Consequently, a devata describes its definitively being the abhideya because of its being the highest good. So this is interesting. Here the argument, if you will, in addition to all that we've heard so far, is that here bhakti is the ultimate shreya, or the ultimate means to achieving well-being, because regardless of the reason that someone takes it up, it will lead one to the attainment of the greatest well-being that one could have, or one could seek, even if one wasn't initially seeking it. So from this point that Jiva Goswami is making right here, you can see clearly how the payars in the Charitamrita are reflecting or are characterizing the principle that's being discussed in this context. So now he comes to analyze the statements of the verse itself. So, upon being requested, it is certainly true that Prabhu bestows the requested object of human beings. There is never irregularity in this regard, is the meaning. But, even in this regard, he is not munificent just by means of that. Meaning he does not just give just that and desist, since when the sensation of the enjoyment of the previously bestowed object occurs, because of the worshippers being unfulfilled with that object after experiencing it for some time, since any worldly object that you achieve will inevitably prove to be not perpetually satisfying, then the worshipper again becomes a requester of him for another object. So you would think that he's quite well aware of this, or in other words, from beginningless time, if people are perpetually seeking objects that are never ultimately fulfilling, and then coming back for another object that's never ultimately fulfilling, and then coming back again, and there's an infinity of jivas doing this from beginningless time, you've got a pretty long queue at your booth. You're pretty well aware of how your service to society is going if you're dealing with this dynamic. So there's no doubt that you would want to sophisticate your approach, having to deal with this level of inefficiency in your attempt to make people happy. So you can understand that if you keep on doing this, you're never going to be able to close your booth. You're going to have to be open 24/7 for eternity. So let's go back to the drawing board here. Maybe it's not the best idea to give these people what they want. And here he gives the reasoning for it, referring to another statement in the 9th canto. Quote, "Desire is never extinguished by enjoyment of objects of desire. It is only, again, further increased thereby, like a fire by oblations of ghee." So this statement immediately follows a rather well-known statement, which says that all the wealth, all the land, all the gold, and all the women in the world are not enough to satisfy the lust of one man. In other words, no matter how much you get of whatever you consider desirable, you can never satiate your desire for it using these inherently unfulfilling objects, namely material objects. So therefore, this statement is made. Why does that happen? Why does none of all of whatever you want ever satisfy you? Because desires are never extinguished by enjoyment of the objects you desire. Rather, the samskaras for perpetually enjoying those things are only deepened, and one carries on running around like a rat on a wheel. So, if you're trying to help people running on this wheel, why keep them running? Why keep them just going from one object to another, to another, to another, when you see that this never actually satisfies them? So therefore, it is actually Bhagavan's compassion to not give the people what they want. Even though there's plenty of religions out there that are based on the idea of praising and conceiving of Bhagavan as the provider of these worldly objects that never satisfy people, and considering that grace and beauty and what have you, as per the view of the Bhagavatam, that is not the idea, or that is not the graciousness of Bhagavan. Rather, the graciousness of Bhagavan is not simply giving you whatever worldly things you want. So thus, in this way intended, he, who is verily supremely compassionate, bestows specifically his own bud-like feet upon even those worshippers of himself who are undesirous of them, as a result of ignorance of the sweetness of those bud-like feet, which are covering of their desires, that is, which are fulfilling of all their desires. In other words, the only object upon attaining which one never desires another object is the feet of Bhagavan, or more specifically, is the Madhurya of Bhagavan. So people who don't know that, and who don't have any experience of that, carry on seeking other things. But once someone has experience of that, then they know that, and they're so satisfied with that experience that they don't seek anything else. So Bhagavan, being compassionate to those who are unaware, gives the people the chance to experience some of that sweetness of himself, whereby they of their own accord give up their interest in pursuit of other objects because they find themselves so fulfilled by the sweetness that they experience in his feet. So now he gives an analogy for this dynamic. As a mother removes clay being chewed from the mouth of a child and places a piece of sugar candy there, like that, he removes those objects his worshippers desire and bestows his feet upon them, which his worshippers find to be completely fulfilling, and thus retain no further desire for the objects. That needs a Y, previously desired, just as a child gives up desire to chew clay after experiencing the sweet taste of sugar candy. So all the parents out there, they have this experience of giving kids what's actually good for them when they don't know what's actually good for them, and then the kids getting upset in the short term by not being given what they want. When you give them vegetables instead of candy and send them to school instead of out to play, then in the short term they get mad and they hate you and they complain, right? But once they grow up, if they're lucky enough to grow up emotionally and culturally, then after a while, they realize that you not giving them candy and play and instead giving them vegetables and education was actually truly care and compassion and love. So similarly, bhaktas are those who mature to the point of understanding and recognizing how it is that Bhagavan is actually gracious. Whereas the immature carry on thinking that the grace of Bhagavan is, if I can borrow from a Summer of Love American rock song, where one singer is saying, "Oh Lord, won't you give me a Mercedes-Benz?" If people carry on thinking, that the achievement of these things is the grace of Bhagavan, and when they get them, then going on praising Bhagavan for how gracious he is, then this is quite childish in the eyes of both Bhagavan and the eyes of bhaktas who have experience of his Madhurya. So, just as it takes composure on the part of a parent to, you could say, help the child traverse that necessary course of maturity whereby they can realize the goodness that was shown to them, then similarly it is the wherewithal or the grace of Bhagavan to, drive or impel his bhaktas along the path of bhakti to the point where they can realize how it was that they were truly graced by Bhagavan to be able to follow that path and reach that state of experience that the path leads to. So this is the purport. In this way as well, the strength of bhakti is described in a karma sarva kamo va. So interestingly, just as in the Caritamrta, the verse under discussion was quoted right after that verse. Interestingly, Jiva Gosvami, in discussing this verse, quotes the exact same verse that was quoted previously. So, for me, this is another one of the cases where it really appears that Kaviraja Gosvami is quite meticulously drawing out a lot of the gist of what's in Jiva Goswami's Sandarbhas and letting that flow out in a smooth, milky, kheer-like substance in the form of the Caitanya-caritamrta. But this point is a little cryptic here of Jiva Gosvami, but it's actually quite interesting. So he says, the strength of bhakti is described in Akama Sarva Kamo Va. So what does he mean just by making this comparison? What is he implying? That Bhakti Yoga is said to be, quote, tibra, or strong or intense, in that previous verse, because it too is said to have the power to bestow upon a sadhaka that which is superior to and beyond even what the sadhaka aspires for by means of the practice of, I think we need the bhakti they are performing. So what you find in some ways that this Akama Sarva Kamava verse has been rendered is that the tibrena is interpreted to mean, or is interpreted to be a modifier of the action performed by the sadhaka. In other words, it's interpreted that the sadhaka should do worship with strong bhakti yoga, means the sadhaka should be strong in their practice. But the way Jiva Gosvami is interpreting it here is he's saying the tibra is actually a modifier of the nature of bhakti. It's not in, although if a sadhaka wants to be strong about their practice, that's certainly fine. We don't object to that. But he's saying that's not the way he's taking out the meaning here. Rather, he's saying that the sadhaka should take up this worship of Bhagavan with this yoga of bhakti, and that bhakti is said to have this quality of being strong. So now he's elaborating, why is this yoga of bhakti specifically called strong, which implies that it's stronger than other types of yoga, such as karma or gyan. So what is that strength or distinguishing strength of bhakti? This is what Jiva Goswami is drawing out. It's just, I find it quite an interesting purport to this statement, saying that the strength of bhakti is that it leads a practitioner of itself to an object that's even greater than the practitioner took up the practice to achieve. That is its strength. So to support that interpretation, now he quotes a statement from the Garuda Puran. Similarly, it is stated in Garuda Puran, quote, when meditated upon, Madhusudan bestows even that which is difficult to attain, which is unattained, and which is not within the range of the mind, and thus priorly unrequested by the worshipper. So this is wonderful. In other words, he gives you more than you can even conceive or potentially desire to get. And it has to be like that if there is an infinite reality full of, these spiritual planes of infinitely wonderful existence that make even the greatest degrees of beauty and apparent satisfaction found within the plane of our empiric experience infinitesimal, insignificant, and comparatively faulty, then for people whose entire scope of experience and reference is confined to that meager, faulty sphere, then those who are situated not only beyond that sphere, but in a purview of the totality of all spheres, how could you let people just sit there and reward them with only what they want from within their limited range of experience? That would be cruel. That would be puny. If these people who can't even conceive or desire anything out of a certain bubble are never given anything that's more than what's in that bubble, then come on, you're just leaving them stuck in the bubble. You'd have to give them something beyond the bubble if you were thinking about their well-being within the context of this broader or infinite reality. So that's, in essence, what's being said here, that Bhagavan, he doesn't just give people what might be difficult to attain, quote, inside the bubble, or what they don't have yet in the bubble, but rather he gives them even what doesn't exist in the bubble, or what they can't even conceive to be, or what beyond even the wonder that they can imagine, he gives them that too. In this way, the attainment of his bud-like feet by means of performance of bhakti, even on the part of knowers of Brahman, beginning with Sri Sonaka, that is, the four Kumaras, is to be understood. That is, although the four Kumaras meditated upon Sri Bhagavan's feet for the purpose of attaining realization of Brahman, Sri Bhagavan ultimately bestowed his feet upon them in lieu of Sayuja Mukti. So this is a core point in the Bhagavatam related to the Kumaras, also Shukadeva Goswami, even persons who whose ultimate concept of ultimate reality was Brahman, nevertheless were blessed by Bhagavan with realization of himself and not only realization of Brahman. So, this is a lovely commentary, and I think it very nicely illustrates the points made in the Caritamrta. So he's saying, you're a fool, I'm not, so I'm not going to give you what you want, I'm going to give you what's actually good for you, I'm going to give you this nectar instead of that poison. In gist is the analysis, if you will, of Bhagavan's cognitive response to the appeals of persons of lesser scope of understanding about what is worthy of being desired. So I just want to add a little bit from Chakravarti Pad's commentary, because he doesn't say that much that's beyond what Jiva Gosvami says, but he does add one interesting point of reference, which also comes to bear upon statements that immediately follow this in the Caritamrta. So for those two reasons, I find it worthwhile of adding one section from Chakravarti Pad's Tika on this verse as well. So this is the Sarita Darshani on that verse in the Bhagavatam. So, quote, "But by performing pure bhakti, that is bhakti unmixed with other paths, such as karma and gyan, even those who are possessed of desire become successful, that is, very similar to desireless bhaktas." Thus the devatas speak this verse. In this regard, however, uniformity in all respects, even in regard to the attainment, lastly, of Bhagavan's bud-like feet on the part of both desireless and desirous bhaktas, is, quote, attention, not to be conceived, since a substance that is pure by nature and one that is purified by force are not of equal value. Thus, the excellence of Hanuman and others, in comparison to Dhruva and others, is observable to verily be paramount. So this is a quite heavy statement, if you will. In other words, if someone takes up the path of bhakti for a vested interest, or an interest other than bhakti, especially when that interest is primary, in other words, in the example of Dhruva, he wanted a kingdom, and to get the kingdom, he worshipped Bhagavan. So his interest in a kingdom was primary, and his motivation to worship Bhagavan was secondary, or it was, merely as a means. Whereas in the case of Hanuman, Hanuman's primary purpose was to serve Ram, to serve Sita Ram. And whatever he did, whatever else it was all for the sake of that. It was not that he had any ambition or interest to fulfill for the purpose of which he served Sita and Ram. So after the battle, after all of his heroics and the mountain flying and everything, when they triumphantly return to Ayodhya, and Ram wants to bestow upon Hanuman a boon for all of his great service, Hanuman says, "No, I don't want anything, Prabhu. I don't want moksha, I don't want any boon." Right? And he tears open his chest, like, what's in my heart? It's just you. What else do I want? So, what is significant here about what Chakravarti Pad is saying is that although by the purifying or the, quote, strong influence of bhakti, whatever the motivation may have been for the practitioner, one will end up at that state of desiring only Bhagavan and worshipping only Bhagavan. Still, the exact degree of excellence or the exact degree of depth in that ultimate attainment will be influenced by the degree of desirelessness or the degree of one-pointedness upon Bhagavan that was present in the motivation during the sadhana stage. This is quite interesting. In other words, what this means is that spending the time to learn these texts, to study the works of Rupa, Sanatana, Jiva Gosvami, all these subtleties about what ultimately can be conceived as the highest sadhya, what ultimately can be conceived as bhakti in a pure form, how those things are conceived by sadhakas, and how desires are fostered in the heart, even in the, for lack of a better word, neophyte sadhaka stage. That matters. And that will have a bearing on the ultimate trajectory of the jiva. And those who, in this, childlike, or in this, very, what can you say, yet to be mature state, so to speak, acquire this level of clarity and acquire this sense of what is a worthwhile ultimate spiritual ideal, and what is the value and the meaning of having one-pointed or desireless bhakti. Going through, taking up this path with that degree of clarity, with that degree of purity in one's ideal, will lead to a spiritual attainment that will be categorically superior to those who take up the path of bhakti without that orientation. So in the case of Dhruva, in the case of others, who are no doubt supreme, greatly worshipable, no doubt, excellent in all degrees, and, in the case of, places in the Bhagavatamrita, places, Jiva Gosvami and the Durgama Sangamani, sometimes when they go to make these kind of distinctions, they say, before I make the following analysis, first I beg forgiveness of those great, supremely worshipful bhaktas whose lives and whose examples are being used to draw out these theological subtleties. And when I put them into hierarchies, it's not with any intent to subordinate anyone in a sense of respectability, but rather for the sense of understanding the depth of ideal that one can ultimately foster. Doing this kind of analysis has value and is necessary. So, loosely put, what they call nahi nindya nyaya, or a comparison which is made not for the sake of defaming someone who in the comparison is in the lesser position, but rather a comparison made for the sake of teaching an important concept. These points are made. So we'll see here in the coming statements the example of Dhruva, and we'll look at statements in the Bhagavatam and commentaries on the Bhagavatam that analyze what happened in the life of Dhruva and what was the significance of this incredibly resolute sadhana that he performed, and the influence of that desire that initially motivated him to take up that sadhana. And this comes to bear upon how a student of all of these teachings and how one aspiring to follow the path of bhakti can be highly benefited by understanding the significance of what desires they foster and what ideals they choose to cherish as sadhakas or as aspirants along this path. And that what they desire, how they approach Bhagavan, will, surprise, surprise, have bearing on how Bhagavan reciprocates with them. We don't need to be surprised by that. Yeyatamam prapadyante tangs tataiva vajamyaham. As they surrender to me, as they approach me, so I reciprocate with them. So, we say in English, be careful what you wish for. And then sometimes they add, because you just might get it. So, to take time and to seriously consider what is really worth wishing for, this is, you could say, the work of the acaryas, or this is the great contribution that they've made to literature, society, scripture, etc., is to, give people the chance to really refine and acquire an understanding of what is truly desirable, what is truly worthy of being cherished as an ideal. And the rest is left up to Bhagavan, or in other words, when people can acquire such an ideal, then they'll get it in the generous sense that if they're sincere in that pursuit and Bhagavan is gracious to them in reciprocation, then why wouldn't they? So, in that respect, this point that there isn't uniformity of attainment in all respects, but rather the ultimate attainment is shaped by the degree of desirous or desirelessness that the sadhaka has in their approach to Bhagavan. And then moreover, in terms of rati, bhav, the specific variety of bhakti that is aspired for, that obviously as well shapes the attainment that a bhakta ultimately can have. So this is, what they call the avadan, or the great contribution of Rupa, Sanatana, Jiva Gosvami, and so forth, is to give people the grounds and the ability to have deep conviction in a truly worthy spiritual ideal, which can lead to a truly excellent spiritual attainment. Okay, so without further elaboration, the following payar and the verse from Haribhakti Sudodaya cited thereafter as evidence for it pertain to those like Dhruva Maharaj who were, quote, purified by force by Sri Bhagavan. So he's talking about these people who are, he calls, great fools, because they worship him, but they want the poison of more mundanity, and the fact that he, as a wise and compassionate God that he is, decides to not let them keep drinking poison and acting like fools or drunks or whatever you want to call it, and rather giving them nectar and giving them what is truly satisfying to them. Then he describes now that same dynamic from the sadhaka perspective. So if a sadhaka comes along and then Bhagavan does that to them, so to speak, then what is the sadhaka's response? So that's what's stated in this payar. He says, Kam lagi Krishna bhaje, pai Krishna rase, kam chari das hoite hoya vilashe. One who worships Krishna for the sake of a desired object thus attains Krishna rasa. So this is, you could say, the whole thing boiled down very, very short, that they started worshipping Krishna for something else, but ultimately, by Krishna's grace and by Krishna's insistence to give them what was best for them rather than what they wanted, they ultimately achieved a particular type of bhav, and with that bhav, tasted a particular type of bhakti rasa in connection with Krishna. Thus, one then forsakes that desired object initially sought and acquires the desire to become a servant of Krishna. Or in other words, once they experience the self-satisfying nature of experience of Krishna's madhurya, then that's so satisfying that they reject the object they were initially seeking, like the kid rejects the desire to continue chewing clay and instead keep chewing the candy that his mom put in his mouth. Then this bhakta no longer wants these mundane things and sincerely then desires, let me just be a servant of Krishna. In other words, let me just absorb myself in bhakti to Krishna. I don't need and I don't want anything else. So the tippani has something on this. If the objection is raised, quote, well, even in that case of Sri Bhagavan bestowing his feet upon even worshippers who do not desire them, those bhaktas who were desirous of other objects certainly still have those various inclinations or vasanas for other objects. So this would be the objection. If Bhagavan says, nope, that's not good for you, I give you this, take this anyway. Then he says, okay. Then if Bhagavan does that, then those bhaktas who wanted those other things, now they got this thing they didn't want, but their psyche is still programmed to want that other thing. So what's going to happen to them now? Just as, when you feed a kid vegetables instead of candy, it's not that immediately he starts to relish the vegetables. He still has the tendency and the preference for candy. So this is the argument, is, okay, that's nice of you to feed the kid vegetables instead of candy, but the kid's still going to want to eat the candy. So what's he going to do with those vegetables that you so kindly tried to feed him? This is the argument that he's posing to the previous statement as a hypothetical objection. So this payar refutes that idea. So those various inclinations or vasanas terminate in servitude to Krishna. And thus they, that is those bhaktas whose inclinations have thus been terminated, do not have any inclination for anything else anymore. This is the purport. In other words, the samskara that is created by the experience of Krishna's madhurya becomes so deep that the bhakti vasana completely trumps, completely overcomes all the other vasanas that were there in the psyche. So they might have been there, they might, whittle away or wither away a little quicker, a little faster, whatever the case may be. When that bhakta has a deeply absorbing, deeply satisfying experience of bhakti, a deeply satisfying experience of Bhagavan, then that bhakti samskara becomes so predominant that everything else becomes irrelevant. And therefore, they only, quote-unquote, want to be a das, or they only want to carry on engaging in bhakti thereafter. So this is how he sets aside that objection. So, to put it in perspective, worldly samskaras do shift, but they typically shift slowly. In other words, when the psyche is conditioned to a particular set of objects and experiences and so forth, we can observe there can be some shift in those preferences, but they typically don't happen quickly, and those that are very deep set are typically very slow to shift. But in the case of this object and this new samskara getting formed, when that object is something constituted of the essence of the Sanvit and Ladini Shaktis of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, in other words, when that object has such a tremendous degree of capacity to produce absorption and satisfaction, then you don't need to worry so much about this. Or in other words, there is certainly potential for that shift to take place when the intensity of the experience of the newly acquired vasana is so profound. So this subject was in what is Bhakti Rasa. I'm not going to elaborate on that here. We discussed that at length in chapter 19 in the Rupa Shiksha, and it comes up again in the next chapter of the Sanatana Shiksha. So in essence, he's just referring to the idea that ultimately these people who took up this path, they ultimately achieve Bhakti Rasa. So what is Bhakti Rasa? That was already discussed and will be discussed again. We won't talk about it now. And from here, he quotes a statement of Hari Bhakti Sudoday, which describes Dhruva Maharaj's experience of specifically describing this shift in focus, or this point where he realizes that the initial object that he sought was no longer worthy of being sought, now that he had been blessed by Bhagavan with the darshan of Bhagavan and experience of Bhagavan, experience of the value of bhakti to Bhagavan. So we'll look at that verse as well as some extensive commentary on it and relevant passages in the Bhagavatam in the next class. So I'll stop here for today. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, feedback of any type, feel free to share. Yes, I see one hand.
Yes, my pranams, Babaji. I would like to just give a small comment that it's very enlivening to hear that Bhagavan also really wants us to get the best thing, even though we may struggle a lot to even desire the best thing. So that's great to learn.
Yes! All right, well, then we'll leave it at that for today. And if we're so blessed, we'll continue our discussion next week. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhisha.
Recording stopped.